Welcome to a Bible talk from Lower Mountains Anglican Church.
One day, Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized, and he said, "No one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor." He also said, "Bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out." When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her, and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so, but if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself, I cannot do it." Now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself," and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David.
Dear Lord and Father, clothe us in kindness today by opening our hearts, minds, and ears to the wonderful ways that you work. Give us insight into your providence and trust in your sovereign rule through Jesus. May you help us to rest in the knowledge of what you've done to care for your people across the ages right through to this age and into the age to come. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I did a little bit of an exercise while I was preparing to give this talk. I went through my wallet and I had a look at all of the reward cards and organisations that I happen to be connected to. I'm a loyal customer, aren't I? Have a guess how many loyalty... No, don't worry, you don't have to guess. I'm loyal to 36 different organisations. I think that's pretty impressive, you know. I think that these organisations should be pretty chuffed that I want to be loyal to them, especially since loyalty costs. Because for many of these loyalty programs, I've had to pay for the privilege of being a loyal customer with whatever this store or company is. Loyalty costs me. I mean, you get the idea. Due to my undying and frequent loyalty, I might benefit in some way, but in order for me to benefit first from whatever store or corporation it is, I need to pay for that privilege by becoming someone who is loyal. Well, friends, loyalty is a theme in the book of Ruth. Loyalty is a key theme in the book of Ruth. Last week as we gathered together, we started to follow the story of a remarkable lady from this little Old Testament book that bears her name, Ruth. Ruth was widowed, childless, foreign, and the daughter-in-law of Naomi, who herself was a widow, who'd lost her 2 only sons and lived in the foreign land of Moab. Both women seemingly without hope and dressed by despair, hence our garment of despair. Ruth shows herself to be loyal beyond measure to her mother-in-law in the face of death and tragedy. And one of the things that we should see, and not just from the book of Ruth, is that when humanity is at its lowest, God is often seen at his best. When humanity is at its lowest, it's often then when we can really see God at his best. And that's certainly the case with this book. We saw how God started to remove the despair and clothe Ruth and Naomi with kindness through a man named Boaz. Today we're going to rejoin that story as we see the benefit of living dependent upon sovereign kindness. Now, if you're the type of person that zones out as we go through this, I really hope you don't, because this is such a fantastic story that if there was only one thing you were to take away from today, is to recognise that there is a wonderful benefit in living dependent upon sovereign kindness. There's wonderful benefits in living dependent upon sovereign kindness. Let me take you to Ruth chapter 3. Have that open in front of you on your tablet, your phone, in the Bible, whichever way. You can see in the outline how the whole book fits together. Before us we have an intentional love story. Some time has passed as this story started last week. Some time has now passed since Ruth met Boaz, and the time has come for this relationship to get a little bit of a nudge. Never underestimate the powers of a mother-in-law. And she gets her fingers into this, and she gives Ruth some suggestions, comes up with a plan. Ruth was to pretty herself up and turn up at the barn where the men were just finishing the harvest by threshing the grain. Now, presumably the end of a really hard season of harvesting. You know, they thresh the grain, then they probably have a little bit of a celebration. So in the barn, they have a few drinks, they celebrate a bit, woohoo, have a whole lot of fun. But they know that the people who get out there with horse and carriage to make sure that you don't drive too fast are out there, so they probably bunker down for the night in the barn in some way. And what Ruth was to do was to wait and watch for them to get into the barn and go to sleep. She had to particularly watch Boaz. Boaz just joined us. She had to particularly watch Boaz, where he lay down, where he slept. The time came, Boaz turned in, Ruth moved into position, and she uncovers his feet and waits. At some point in the night, perhaps with cold feet, Boaz awakes to find Ruth. She identifies herself as his servant and then boldly asks for his help. Verse 9, you can see that there. You are a guardian redeemer of our family. Spread the corner of your garment, or the corner of your blanket maybe, over me. It's a pretty bold move. Now, let's pause for a moment and see if we can get our head around this idea of the guardian redeemer. And what I want you to do is put your finger in Ruth and flip back with me to Deuteronomy chapter 25. Can somebody yell out the page number? Deuteronomy chapter 25. 199. Deuteronomy chapter 25, 199, verse 5. Okay, 200, verse 5. Now, under Israelite law, there was a provision made to care for widows in a way that preserved their family heritage. And that's what we see here. Verse 5, if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that the name will not be blotted out from Israel. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders of the town and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of the town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. Okay, now that is called the Levirate law. The Levirate law. Now you can see that there are several benefits of this law. It ensures that widows are cared for in a time when women without a husband would have been very vulnerable in society. And it ensures that the dead man's family name would be continued on. And it did that by ensuring that the firstborn of the new remarriage would then carry the name of the husband, of the first husband. It also meant that the widow did not lose her claim on property or land that she owned with her dead husband. So this is a good law. This is a generous law to care for those who'd be most vulnerable. Now, you Christians who like wearing sandals, here's a Bible verse for you that you can say, look, in the Bible, this is the reason why we wear sandals. I want you to know that there is nothing in here that says that you should wear socks with sandals. Okay, let's keep going. What's worth recognizing here is that this law, like any law that comes with obligation, comes at a cost. You have to feel for the woman who doesn't like her brother-in-law. And you have to feel for the man who's landed with the obligation to care for his sister-in-law at the expense of his own family name. There's risk involved here as well. The brother might already be married, might already have his own family and has his own property, his own land. And so to take on a widow and her dependents means that his estate will now be divided across more people. So there's risk that goes with this as well. So this law, it's not primarily about self-gain, which is often the way we think about inheritance. It's about obligation to ensure that the right thing is done. And sometimes doing the right thing costs. Back to Ruth chapter 3. Boaz, now awake, reads Ruth's boldness as a kindness, as the text says, and in his response you can see that there is an affection that's grown between these two. Boaz recognises that Ruth is not chased after the younger men, rich or poor, and Boaz commends Ruth for being, in verse 11 you can see there, a woman of noble character. We've already seen the same expression in Hebrew used of Boaz when he's called a man of standing. Translation doesn't show that for us here, but it's the same expression there. He's a man of standing, she's a woman of noble character. Maybe these two are made for one another. Boaz has done his homework. He understands that he does have an obligation as her guardian redeemer, but he also knows that he's not first in line. There's another one he has to speak to first. And so he gives his word, he makes her a promise, and says, as surely as the Lord lives, I will redeem you if the more prominent kinsman does not claim his right over you. Now the night passes, and before the other men wake, Ruth returns home. And like other interactions with Boaz, she returns to Naomi with gifts. She's given 6 measures of barley. This is a man who has provided very well for Ruth and in turn Naomi. Well, let's get into chapter 4. And we now see how this story flows. Boaz is a man of his word. He heads to the city gate, like the Levirate law suggested. He waits to see if the guy who trumps him in the family line of succession shows himself. You've got to sort of think, if Naomi and Ruth have been back in town for a while now, that maybe this person should have stepped up and done something by this point. But no, Boaz finds the man. He gathers 10 elders as a witness. And the conversation that plays out is skillful and calculated. He tells his kinsman about Naomi, that she's returned, that she has land to sell. Now that's new information in the book at this point, so presumably Naomi and Boaz have got together and she sort of said, well actually I have this parcel of land, maybe you can use that in the negotiations, you'll have to represent me, I cannot represent myself. And so Boaz is going in there knowing that he has this land to use as a bit of a lever. Boaz suggests to his kinsman that he buy the land, and in doing so, he would redeem it. And you can imagine the guy, property portfolio and dollar signs going, cha-ching, cha-ching, this is a good day, whoa, I managed to get this is great. You know, if you think that one through, I get an old lady who might not last that much longer, her land, and my estate grows, woohoo, of course I'm going to redeem it, he says. Now the masterstroke. And we all hold our breath. Boaz then mentions Well, of course, on the day that you redeem the land, you'll also gain Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, and with her the obligation to continue her dead husband's family name. Cough, cough. That's not what I expected. Splutter, splutter. That's more than I was really bargaining for. This is not so good a deal. For this kinsman to proceed, he inherits an obligation that would put his family line and his estate at risk. At least it would divide his estate. And as it turns out, there's an obligation. This obligation is just too much for him to risk. And so you can see he rejects the deal. Verse 6, I cannot redeem, you redeem it yourself. And we breathe again. As we heard from Deuteronomy, the way that deal is sealed is by the kinsman removing his sandal, offering it to Boaz, and now we have a new agreement. Story back on track. But Boaz is not quite done yet. In the presence of those gathered, and with the authority of the elders who are there as witnesses, Boaz announces his redemption. It is a costly exercise, yet clearly one that Boaz is happy to commit to. He buys the property from Naomi, he acquires Ruth, he takes her as his wife, and in doing so announces his intention to ensure that Elimelech's family name would continue. This has been a busy day for this guy. The elders and all of the people that are around are thrilled. After all, who doesn't like a wedding? Well, let's pause again and think about this marriage. Throughout scriptures, we read about several marriages, and this one is no exception. It's clear that God thinks highly of the marriage relationship. A marriage comes with obligations, costly obligations. Here, the marriage arrangement between Boaz and Ruth is couched in redemption language. And it gives us a picture of how we really should be thinking through marriage, or how we should be thinking through marriage the way God would want us to think about it. One gives wholly of himself so that the other might be redeemed. Now, we need to be careful today to ensure that we recognise the importance of marriage and that we don't undermine it by thinking lesser of it. If we think about marriage individually, as if I am first and foremost the person that needs to be able to be considered in this arrangement, then I will undermine the purpose of marriage. What we see here with Boaz is that marriage comes at a cost that benefits the other. Boaz has something to offer, and he gives it to redeem Ruth. Now, for Australia and in many parts of the world, the marriage debate's been on the agenda for a while. And you know that we've now legalised same-sex marriage in this country. As that debate has raged, a lot of language that's been used has been about rights. My rights. The rights of each person to experience what they each want. It struck me that for a debate about marriage, which brings two people together, there is a lot more talked about about the individual rights of people and what individuals are supposed to be allowed to have. But it's not just what our gay friends might say. Many of those who have talked to me about marriage, and this includes lots of Christians, they've talked about it as something that is first and foremost individual, about what marriage would bring them, be that happiness or security or love or company or whatever the list has on that one. We have turned the covenant of marriage completely on its head. And in doing so, we're at risk of turning marriage into a fairy tale. To place upon this institution, this covenant of marriage, something that really it was never actually supposed to do. and give us unreal expectations about what marriage is actually doing. Biblical marriage comes with obligations, costly obligations. And it's best understood when we look at it through the lens of redemption, when one offers what they have at great expense for the benefit of another. Well, of course, the best example is, in fact, of somebody who never got married. Jesus. He gave of himself to redeem those who could not redeem themselves. He offered at great expense his life for the benefit of the other, so that those who believe in him would share in his redeemed life. Boaz is Ruth's kinsman redeemer. He gave of himself at great expense so that she would share in his redeemed life. That is marriage. In the book of Ruth, we see an intentional love story unfold and a marriage set in the context of redemption. But there's another love story unfolding in the book of Ruth. It is the Lord's intentional salvation story. Verse 13, Boaz and Ruth marry, and then we read that the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Throughout the whole story, the Lord's not been far away, has he? You know, in chapter 1, through the lens of despair and tragedy, we saw the Lord come to the aid of his people and provide food. And now, as the book starts to draw to a close, we see the Lord enable life and joy and the conception of a baby boy. And it's Naomi who now appears to be redeemed. Despair, tragedy, now through to life and joy, all in the space of these 4 chapters, and all in the context of redemption. One thing that we should learn from this book is that no matter what the circumstance, it is the Lord who works through the circumstance to bring about what is good for his people. In the good and the bad, the Lord works to bring about his purposes, and it is his people who will benefit. Naomi's been pulled through tragedy, bitterness, depression, and she now holds her impossible grandson in her arms and gazes upon new life with joy and hope and security. This is a gorgeous story. But it's not just a story, it's history. And it's not just Naomi who's been clothed in kindness by the Lord here. It is for the generations to come who will be blessed by this baby. For from Naomi through Boaz and Ruth, this baby Obed became the father of Jesse, who became the father of David, that is King David. And through his line, 28 generations later, we come to Jesus, who's the Messiah, our true kinsman redeemer. I think it's wonderful that in Matthew chapter 1, in Luke chapter 3, we see a genealogy that traces you right back to this time in Israel's history. And Ruth is mentioned. Isn't it wonderful that in the record of God's chosen people, Ruth the Moabite has been added into that illustrious group? And you know why that is so wonderful? Not just because it's wonderful that a woman is mentioned in there. It's wonderful because that means we could be mentioned in there. Most of us don't come from the tribe of Israel. One who lived through despair and tragedy and then was brought new life and hope. A hope for widows, the childless, the foreigners. Actually, a hope for all people. Well, the book of Ruth teaches us about what true loyalty looks like. And not just that of Ruth to her mother-in-law Naomi, not just of Boaz to Ruth, the Moabite, but of the Lord, who over the span of time, in history and in his providence, through thick and thin, brought about the salvation of all who call upon him. A loyalty that cost him greatly, yet was for the benefit of those he redeemed. Yet I hope you can see in Ruth that providence acknowledges both God's sovereign lordship over all things, and yet allows human freedom, our freedom, to live that out under his sovereign rule, such that we can know that he's there, he cares, he rules, he provides, all while I do the things that I do, and all while we do the things that we will do. And that in all of that, he asks us to depend upon him in all things. Our story is an intentional, dependent story. That's what it means for us to be loyal. A loyalty that costs. But I've got to tell you, friends, the benefits are out of this world. And friends, that is far better than what any reward scheme or loyalty program that gives you a plastic card can offer. And so the best possible way to respond to that is probably to pray. But before we pray, can I make one last observation that you also see right throughout this book of Ruth? This book is filled with prayer. Over and over again across these pages, we see the people in the circumstances praying. You have Naomi in chapter 1, verse 8, praying that the Lord would show kindness. You have Boaz in chapter 2, verses 4 and verses 12, praying or calling upon the Lord to do what it is that he said he would do. In chapter 2, you have Naomi praying again when he realizes how wonderful it is that Boaz has been able to step up, as it just so happens, and she calls out to bless the Lord in the way that that works. Boaz prays in chapter 3, verse 10, when he realizes the kindness that's shown to him from Ruth. The elders pray when they see the coming together of Boaz and Ruth into a marriage. They pray and give thanks to God. And then when the little baby is born and is placed in the hands, this impossible baby, placed in the hands of grandma, the women around her pray and give thanks to God. Do you see that in times of tragedy and despair and times of joy and happiness, that the right response for a person of faith is to pray? In the tough stuff, pray. In the wonderful stuff, pray. That is a great Christian privilege. So let's do that. Dear Lord and Father, thank you for redeeming us under your sovereign rule through Jesus. Clothe us in kindness in the wonderful ways that you work. Give us insight into your providence through thick or thin. Help us to trust you in all things, resting in the knowledge of what you do to care for your people, what you do for our benefit into eternity. And we pray this in Ruth and Boaz's great, 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 and more grandson's name, Jesus. Amen.
You have been listening to a Bible talk from Lower Mountains Anglican Church. If you'd like to know more about Jesus, get further information, or download other resources, please visit our website at lmap.org.au.